This is perhaps yet again another installment of one of the sets of continuing discourses and engagements, conversations, ongoing conversations that is represented by the title Further Notes on the Importance of Context in Representational, Rhetorical, Descriptive, Demonstrative, Illustrative, and Performative Acts of Communication. So I believe that whatever results from my speaking today will have that initial title, and then whatever we move toward, in the course of my speech, my talk, will perhaps have a subtitle, most likely have a subtitle, and I'm not entirely certain where we might be going. And I'm not even sure that what I'm going to discuss, engages with the speaker that I'm going to assume that I'm engaging with, and listeners to this particular series, Further Notes on the Importance of Context in Representational, Rhetorical, Descriptive, Demonstrative, Illustrative, and Performative Acts of Communication will understand why, in dealing with space-time travel communication coordinates, which are authorially indeterminate, right? Because they're represented by examples of observation as communication and numerical values, particularly numerical values of views, which can be spread across a wide range of domains, but usually I choose from views represented on various YouTube pages of individuals whom I either know or have known or are aware of or become aware of in the course of investigating, examples of space-time communication coordinates, and this idea of communication as observation and observation as communication, and so when one looks at one's own channel or another channel, one cannot be certain that the number of views have been manipulated by any particular identity, but there may be clues in the direction that a space-time communication coordinate takes one in determining who one is addressing. And even if the conversation is imaginary, I'm not particularly concerned with either the actual nature or virtual nature, the imaginal or real or symbolic or indeterminacy, right? So one could say that acts of communication fall within the symbolic, and the symbolic is representational. And the representational symbolic has intentionality, and phenomenon in the universe belongs to the domain of the physical sciences, and is restricted by laws and rules and regulations. Other than those types of rules and transformative processes that define language, right? Language has rules, as is obvious in syntax and morphology and all of the other sets, right, of principles of pattern and organization that belong to language, from phonology through or from phonetics through phonology and then morphology, and then on to syntax, and then on to larger units of discursive structure and organization, and finally to meta-communicative linguistic constructs that also are organized by patterns, right? But these laws or rules or patterns or restrictions are clearly different from the kinds of principles of the physical universe that we also can consider laws, right? Like how gravity works, or thermodynamics, or space and time, and even if our perceptions of space and time, change and alter them and affect not only our understanding of them, but their actions themselves, we can, articulate these, what were once, in a positive, right, in a positive epistemological and metaphysical framework, considered objective, right, and therefore not really belonging to that human domain of intentionality. Well, in observation as communication and communication as observation, obviously, and particularly in systems in which duration and patterns of time and the notion of the moment, right, as singularity, defining an event, from which one can see horizons of duration expanse in both directions, backwards and forwards, and perhaps in other directions as well, right, opening to different domains of experience. That distinction between the objective physical world and the symbolic human communicative world, start to break down and become interesting. Okay, so that in part explains why we may not be addressing any particular subject or identity, but that but our address nevertheless, right, has a certain kind of linguistic logic to it and obeys certain kinds of rules, both in terms of communicative acts and the rules they follow in order to be communicative, right? That it's not utter nonsense, and actual events in the sort of quantum mechanics of the physical universe as well. So I'm not going to go to this site and justify the first moment of sort of instantiating communicative gesture, but you'll have to take my word for it. On the Penn Sound side, Charles Bernstein, introduces Pierre Joris, and Pierre, who is a member of the set of Pierre Jays, whom we have discussed before, reads an essay of his on Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, and the reading for the performance is inspired by the recent terrorist assault on Rushdie, and the reading is quite good and addresses the politics of Rushdie's novelistic performance in this volume, and then the audience response to it, and in this time of increasing terrorism and threat that many of us who have felt in one way or another, for whatever reason, whatever positionality that we have felt marginalized by or from in relationship to culture, and however that marginalization has been experienced. But those of us who have had a history of violence directed against us, I think have good reason to be concerned at this growing rise of global fascism, and whether that fascism is defined by Christianity, or defined by Judaism, or defined by Islam, or defined by whatever it is that provides the ideological and symbolic, so cultural symbolics, right, support for that apparatus, that there's good reason to be concerned. And so in that respect as well, the discussion is appreciated, particularly on the part of this particular Pierre J, who is insightful and and without using the word clear, but a very articulate spokesperson for both complexities, right, and ambiguities of meaning in the reading of these complex types of literary text, and also a very good spokesperson for engaging in the ethics and I want to say political emergency. I like the word emergency because it suggests both the emergent and the crisis, right, of our contemporary system, but the political emergency in which these meanings exist, and in which we find ourselves engaged with either from a position of concern or from a position of radical engagement, which would not negate concern, but would perhaps be a further emergence into the if one could say dialectic of action. And so again, without proving an origin or of this particular, or inception for this particular space-time communication coordinate discussion, I'll just make the claim that on this page, as I observed it this morning, right now it's 4:42. I observed it a few minutes ago. The number of views was 202, and the number of likes, which are represented by this little emoji thumbs up, which is interesting because that historically that thumbs up goes back to Rome and the gladiatorial arena, right, in which the audience, right, had some kind of say, I believe, not exactly democratic, but audience members in this public display of violence and a kind of a form of human sacrifice for the purpose of entertainment, right? So this entertainment sacrifice in which slaves were forced to kill one another for the sadistic pleasures of the Roman public and the emperor, in the end, if one of them if both of them survived, and had an opportunity to ask, the crowd and the emperor, I believe, unless it's a myth, that we've developed around the idea of a democracy, of a demos, and because Rome never was really a democracy that had a senate, but it's quite different in its social political organization than Greece was, even though Greece also had slaves, and the idea of being a citizen was again very limited and defined to those kind of patriarchal and racial, right, limitations that are familiar to us in the United States, and that are re-emerging as the rights of women and individuals of color are being stripped, right, from us by the fascist right, and again, so returning to the idea of global fascism. But anyway, I believe that it's not merely a representation of Hollywood, but the crowd would would, either give the thumbs up or the thumbs down, and then the emperor, of course, had the ultimate say. If he were present, there may have been, I don't know, if there was an acting, sort of like master of ceremonies, MC or ringmaster, in the absence of the emperor, or if the emperor had to be present if you were going to, force a slave to kill another slave. But in any case, the emperor would have the ultimate say. But I believe that the crowd, were allowed to express their opinions, and you would add these up, and if there were, or the emperor would add them up, or or evaluate them, and I suppose he could, just like today, when we have these, so-called, democratic elections, and we don't really have, right, a voting system in which you tally up all of the votes, and the larger number of those votes won, right? And we have on our page, we have a representation of how the Electoral College works and what voting clout means across states, and how gerrymandering and various other means, right, of organizing these, systems of democracy into unfair, and sort of systematically systematically self-interested, right, organizations of power really alter the expression of democracy, and make it much less a matter of counting and determining in the distribution and tally of votes, who actually won, than it does in working the system, organizing. It's like, in a way, you could say, like hackers on space-time communication coordinates, right? I'm always really annoyed when I have 2 or 3 or 4 views of a video, and suddenly it turns into 0. Well, you can't erase what you saw, right? So I always think of this as like very similar to like election manipulation. And we discounted your views because we want to express our own idea, and you can express your own idea by looking more, right? And a fair way of using space-time communication coordinates is just by looking again and again and again, or you don't even have to look. You can just click away, I suppose. But I always find it really annoying, and hacking in general I find really annoying, because I consider it a form of anti-democratic and invasive so Michel Foucault looks at this idea of the panopticon, right? And I think it's in Discipline and Punish, but maybe it's elsewhere. I haven't read Foucault in decades, actually. But the idea originally is not from Foucault. So the original idea of this panopticon comes from Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century, and it was one of these designs that was considered a kind of it was a disciplinary concept, but it arose out of an idea of what was the idea how to express this, humanitarian discipline, right? So this idea that a guard could see in this panoptical tower every cell and inmates, but the inmates can't see into the tower, and and these prisoners would never know, when and if they were being watched, and therefore, their behaviors would reflect this sort of self-disciplinary action out of fear of being caught, right? And that is considered a more humanitarian way, in Bentham's weird sort of privacy-free imagination, but also reflected this sort of notion of the all-seeing eye, the omniscient deity, right? And like a way of like internalizing that idea of omniscient deity in the minds, right, of these observed prisoners. So there's a certain sense in which hacking like presumes like the right and authority to perform this act of invasion of one's privacy, and therefore invasion of one's mind. Hacking totally lends itself to this idea of gaslighting, right? And one of the things that I wanted to do with because I have been hacked for years, perhaps perhaps decades, but and there are tales and stories of how some of this works in this particular YouTube channel, and if you're interested, you can look at that and find out who some of these culprits are, or who I suspect some of these culprits are. Certainly more than one example, but when I first developed this idea of observation as communication in this particular system of space-time communication of coordinates, it was in some way hoping to open up into a kind of democratic and communicative, right, way of sharing of information that, in my mind, belonged more to the Underground Railroad than it did to the Panopticon. And so when these panoptical elements come back in, and data, right, is manipulated in ways to me that seem to express profoundly, anti-democratic and self-invested I don't think always examples of gaslighting, but certainly potentially examples of gaslighting, then I'm disappointed, and sometimes that disappointment I express in the form of irony, and by calling attention to the manipulations, and sometimes I express it in other ways, but in any case, the idea, right, of the system was that one could communicate in ways that one hadn't imagined before, and open up the possibilities of dialogue, or dialogos. Within these message units and systems and processes that were in some ways overdetermined, because for example, in pointing to this particular space-time communication coordinate 202 5, right, it's overdetermined. That the system itself, right, is in a way, the number 202, right, point 5, isn't an example of overdetermination, but once we arrive here, right, the possibilities, right, of ambiguity and the need for contextual framing and understanding and interpretation are overdetermined because from the point of view of what I will engage across these systems, one selects items that are not fixed in terms of their meanings, but rather open to the expanse of multiple possibilities. And so however we got to this unit, Kantara, within Lisa Gerard, the best of Lisa Gerard, the album, we didn't get there, singularly, on our own, whoever we are, right? So I know that I clicked, right, and I changed the views on this particular YouTube video, and so I had some effect of getting to this number 202, and then once I initiated having an effect, which I believe I began maintaining having an effect at the number 144. So it's possible that a single observer could have clicked 144 to get there, but it's unlikely, and that's why there's a certain amount of overdetermination in attaining this particular position, right? Strictly speaking, overdetermination is when a singularity is determined by multiple causes, and in this instance, viewing the viewers, I assume that to get to 202 views, there were more than I assume there were more than two viewers. I know I was a viewer, and I know that before I viewed, there were other viewers, and so there were at least two, but I can't determine that number, and I'm not sure that anyone other than someone with the technological expertise to investigate these systems could determine it. And I'm not really interested in determining it at that level. I mean, it could become another operator in the system of conveying meaning, but because I can't reach it, it can't become another operation that I'm engaged with as signifying, and so we leave that. But the overdetermination that exists in the causes, right, that get us to this, create interesting potentialities, right, for interpreting meaning and ambiguity and the indeterminacy of sender and receiver systems, right? So back to the title that we are, perhaps giving to this video, further notes on the importance of context in representational, rhetorical, descriptive, demonstrative, illustrative, and performative acts of communication. The site itself, right? This particular space-time travel communication coordinate emerges from involves a discussion by a Piaget, and this particular Piaget I know to have been a translator of anagrams, and looking at this word Kantara, I could certainly choose the Spanish musical reference, and and go in that direction. But also knowing that that Lisa Gerard is a singer. In some ways, she is certainly a mystic, and she often sings in this expressively mystical language, which technically can be defined as an idioglossia as opposed to an idiolect, right? And an idioglossia is somewhat different from the description that we have from glossolalia, in that glossolalia seems to be a spontaneous, involuntary expression of a certain psychological state that could be said to belong to one of those psychological states that William James discusses in varieties of religious experience, and it belongs to that ecstatic state, and it's represented in Pentecostal Christianity as the speaking of tongues, and in certain kinds of certain classes, right, of Christian devotional worship. The expression of tongues, continues to be, even to this day, an example of receiving the Holy Spirit as it was represented in those volumes that represent the initial receiving of this particular form of the Holy Spirit in those books that describe the Christian Pentecost as this speaking that emerges from tongues of fire, and there's actually a lot in what Lisa Gerard does that seem to reference that in various ways, right? Like right above Kantara, we have the host of seraphim. Well, the seraphim are an interesting form of angel. They're angels of the presence, angels of the throne, and in the presence of the name, their expression of adoration and which really belongs to their very form and existence, right? Is that they consume themselves. They are these say fiery serpents that burn, and in singing the name of God and in praise, they like these tongues of fire, right? They become fire, flame, and in the process, consume themselves and are in consumed, one could say, inhaled and absorbed into the presence and all these ideas of like the body of these spiritual entities have to be taken as metaphors, but and as would fire in this representation, but consumed by God in the form of their the incense of their adoration, I suppose. And then return to themselves once again, and complete this process infinitely and eternally. So that even there the reference to this kind of mystical union is made, and to this host of different kinds of angels, perhaps. So knowing that about Pierre Jarry's and the anagrams, kind of leads me toward making a meaning out of Kantara that belongs to the domain of anagrams, right? And what immediately, jumps out is arcana, and arcana, and then from the word arcane, and so secret and hidden, and then you have a leftover T, right? And that T. So okay, so jumping to another context. So that's the first context, is the anagrams, and then Pierre Jaurès, makes note of all of the influences, the literary influences in Salman Rushdie's the Satanic Verses, and one of those influences is Italo Calvino. And what I was thinking about Italo Calvino in relationship to Arcana is this one particular volume of his, the Castle of Crossed Destinies, which is two different stories, but both of which are told in different ways using the tarot deck. And in one, the characters who tell their stories use the tarot deck because Buñuel was really fond. Louis Buñuel was really fond of this device, like creating a situation in which an ordinary situation in which suddenly one single phenomenon would change the whole nature of the situation. Like putting a group of individuals at a dinner party, in a situation in which they couldn't leave, and then how that social situation would devolve into whatever moral or ethical turmoil or chaos, right? And in a way, it's a similar device that Calvino used. Some for whatever reason, magical or otherwise, his characters can't speak, and so they're forced to communicate their stories with this tarot deck, and they choose these cards, and then the narrator, particularly in the first of these stories, explains their stories in terms of his interpretation of reading these tarot decks. Well, in a way, that's precisely what space-time travel communications do, right? So I'm interpreting Kantara as a communication, which it might not be. It could be just a number. It could be there were 202 views and 5 people liked it. It's not a communication, right? You could take it that way. But because I've created this system, and because I'm allowing for indeterminacies of communication to exist within frameworks of interpretation, I can justify the reading by the very terms of the confusion, like the sort of Einsteinian post-quantum mechanical confusion of the terms that exist between physical phenomenon and discursive operations, right? And so whether one regards it as a magical trick or as just a more complicated understanding of the universe of communication than has existed prior, right? It can go 2 ways. Well, it's like you created this trick show, or you could say, oh, you're looking at it in a way that people haven't looked at it before, and stepping out of like conventions of single identification of a speaker as this unitary, solitary entity from which a meaning emerges, and you've allowed this overdetermination of factors to become a kind of expressive voice, although the expressivity itself is problematized by what you do. So there are different ways of looking at it, but because it's created as a system, and because the system is articulated in terms of rules of looking, and because that and I do believe that there are some rules, and those rules can be violated, and you can address, numbers that change in the system in terms of like stabilities of restrictive violations and restrictive fidelity, right? So if I have one of those situations where a view was 2, and via the Cheshire Cat effect becomes 0, I can either take that space-time coordinate on its face value, pretend that there was no cheating, or or I can address it within the reading, right? So that the cheating itself becomes another factor in what you could say like exists as the overdetermination matrix out of which this particular kind of communication system arises, right? And that would be the way that I would prefer to address those kinds of Cheshire Cat style rule violations within the system. Just as, say that we're talking about an ordinary grammar, like talking about a grammar like transformational grammar like Chomsky's. Well, say you're a language poet, and you violate sentence structure in a certain way, right? Well, that's certainly allowable, but in terms of reading and interpreting such a gesture, or if it were a morphological violation, right? Taking the A's out of the word Kantara, you would want to address that in modes of hermeneutic and interpretive analysis of the work. You wouldn't simply ignore them and say, okay, so here Kantara has no A's, right? And if 3 A's are removed, you would want to address that. And the idea of removing vowels, from a word like Kantara is, certainly not certainly not doesn't exist outside of language use precedent, right? In writing, may exist outside of language use precedent in speaking, but there are a number of writing systems in which vowels are either underrepresented or not represented at all, and those systems, or in which there are no strictly speaking letters, right? Like in Egyptian hieroglyphs, there are no letters, or in other writing systems as well, whether those are represented as cuneiform or Chinese characters, that different relationships between those types of glyphs and signs and inscriptions may or may not even represent the idea of phonemes in a language. I mean, they certainly do in Chinese characters, but in some types of writing, even that is absent. And so the idea, right, of removing those vowels and representing the word Kantara as CNTR isn't completely novel. And if we were to take that route, and there is some precedent for that. Now, if I were to engage the response and the direction toward Kantara as resulting more from Charles Bernstein than from Pierre Jaurès, which is another example of how context changes the nature of the message, I would perhaps be more likely to take the removal of the three A's as a possibility of interpretation, and to read the CNTR. And that could, represent a number of different things. If I filled in with new vowels, I see the word centaur, or perhaps it's something else. Cant R, or canter, as in, the Canterbury Tales. Well, Canterbury Tales takes us in an interesting direction, but the context that is pushing the determination for my interpretation. And again, we've talked about intuition in systems of interpretation within what would you call it? Underdetermined, perhaps underdetermined semiotic variables. Intuition plays an important role because there is underdetermination in the direction that one takes, and one has multiple options, multiple directions. In this case, not a castle of cross destinies, but a castle of potential multiple destinies, right? Or in string theory, I don't know if Pierre Jaurès, mentioned or didn't mention Borges in talking about some of the influences of on Salman Rushdie's magical realism. He did mention magical realism, but I don't know if he explicitly mentioned Borges. But Borges, has a number of different stories in which this idea of narrative movement forward, right, can be determined by these one could call them forking paths, right? And in string theory, you have this as well, and this leads to certain kinds of space-time travel paradoxes, that the one of the most famous of which is sort of parabolized in this story of Schrodinger's cat. But without getting into all of that, the possibility, right, of these various forking paths of interpretation running alongside like the physical universe of the space-time travel communication coordinate itself is part of the system, right? And so I'm going to explore one branch, and I'm going to choose the Piaget branch just because I'm fond of the way that I won't even say that I can truly say that I'm that I like the way that Pierre Jaurès utilizes space-time travel communication coordinates. But in my imagination, somewhere in my imagination, as part of this system of overdetermination, there's some kind of subjectivity related, to the idea of this particular Piaget, whose use of these systems, whether real or imaginary, I like because of the complexity of them and the way they seem to move across these intersectional and interdynamic discursive domains. All right, so having said all of that, we're going to take the Piaget branch, which is not to be confused with the Piaget four-step, which, if you're interested in, you can find elsewhere on this particular channel. But let's take the first of all, we got rid of the Kantara, and then we got rid of the Centaur, and let's focus on Arcana and T, and the T is an easy it's easy to rework the T into 20, and if we do that, and if you think of, did I finish the discussion of the T again? Like, could refer back to Italo Calvino as T0, right? In which case it means time. So arcana time possible, but I'm thinking judgment. I'm thinking the 20th card in the tarot deck is judgment, and then from there, which is already several leaps, but I'm assuming that Pierre Jaurès can make these leaps, and and his moves are already referred to as leaps, turns and transformations elsewhere. I'm thinking, particularly because of the way that judgment is represented in the tarot, and I've just opened up a window on this card, that something can be said about this. Well, first of all, you have a representation of an angel, clearly an angel, who has the number 20 for whatever reason in Roman numeral representation, sitting on top of his head, blowing this horn. And then you have, the symbol of Christianity in the cross. And you have this interesting configuration of figures, right, receiving the message of this herald, right? And then the heraldry is marked in a number of different ways, right? It's marked with the horn, and it's marked with this particular flag. And the nudity of these figures, receiving this this message from this messenger, right? Both in Hebrew and in Greek, both Malach and Angelos, refer to this figure as messenger, receiving this as a kind of what seems to me revelatory in ecstasis, and this card, here is referred to as the judgment. Well, that's different from the word that appears on the card, judgment, isn't it? And that's interesting too. But the imagery, suggests, as the Wikipedia site, reveals, that this is both an image of resurrection and possibly the Last Judgment, which the Last Judgment itself, the book of Apocalyptos, the revealing, right, could be said in, if you interpret it this way, as could be said to be a symbolic or allegorical representation of the soul's journey toward the attainment of a certain goal of mystical experience, right? And it's certainly a horrific view of it, but those individuals who have experienced the dark night of the soul know that it's fairly horrific, right? So or one could take it more traditionally, and apocryphally, I suppose, as merely, right, the historical destiny of mankind, so depending on how literal or metaphorical or symbolic one chooses to be, there are multiple interpretations of this particular apocalyptos, this particular revealing. And it's interesting on the now the horn, for me, is associated with the Malach and Archangel, Gabriel, and that would make it interesting in relationship to the discussion of Salman Rushdie and the communication from this particular Piaget, because he discusses the role of the figuration in Rushdie's text and the satanic verses of this angel, Gabriel, and his transformation into the angel Azrael, which also makes sense here, although in this particular image, the message is clearly, well, I don't know if clearly, but to my eye, much more optimistic, even Edenic in the returning of the carelessness in which these figures bask, right? And it's like nude beaches in Southern California, and this idea of return to Edenic innocence, or communes in which nudity is practiced. William Blake was a practitioner of nudity, and often there's a painting by Blake called Glad Day, in which this nude male figure spreads his arms in sort of ecstatic self acceptance, and the way that the arms are spread suggests like a reaching out, right, to the world and the air and universe, and folding into it almost. So this moment of ecstasis, but also I believe his foot is on a worm. So in a certain sense, and symbolically in this, and then in the background somewhere there's a bat, but and the bat is interesting and complex, and we probably don't have time to talk about it. But the placement of his foot on the worm suggests that that symbolically the image also represents the defeat, right, of death, and so the angel here and the fire, right, of the angel, like, is interesting. Like that, I'm assuming that yellow and orange, one could say gold on his that represent his hair is a kind of fire, right? And so the fire and the trumpet and then this and the sounding of the trumpet represented here as these rays, and then this ecstatic experience as if these individuals were receiving the Holy Spirit and being welcomed up. Like in William Blake's depiction of Glad Day, the figures are glad, right? So the judgment isn't, at least upon these individuals, doesn't seem to be malicious, right? Or they're not, they don't appear to be they don't appear to be condemned, right, to some domain or circle of hell. Rather, they're receiving their victory in eternity over death, right? And that includes the removal of shame, and their ability to present themselves without clothing, and in the fullness of their experience, both as social beings and transcendent. Now look, they're in these little boxes, right? So are they individuals who have already died? Presumably this is a possibility, and they're being resurrected. So what's interesting is that the resurrection, and the last judgment, come together in this in this interesting depiction. And the Wikipedia site says an angel, possibly Metatron, probably Israfil. Now that construction is really interesting. Possibly Metatron, but probably Israfil, and or Israfil, and is depicted blowing a great trumpet, from which hangs the flag of St. George. Okay. And then it claims that there are references to the 15th chapter, of 1 Corinthians. So Yeah, and then it does mention that these are cribs. It takes the same interpretation that I have, and but let's see what Wikipedia says about Aziraphale. What interests me in the image more than the idea of final judgment is the references, to the angels and the horn, and what they might represent in terms of a message communicated from a figure such as Pierre Jarry's, from the context of this discursive engagement with the satanic verses, in which angels figure significantly, and humans metamorphosize into angels, and through various say morphs of these angels, specifically one that metamorphosizes from Gabriel to Azrael, and in a certain sense, that would be the interpretation that is not represented in that image. So Israfil, or Israfel, is the angel who blows the trumpet. On the last day of judgment in Islam, and in this sense, this particular angel seems to relate to the discussion of the satanic verses in a way that's profoundly significant. And this particular angel here, it says, is perhaps, and as described in the Book of Dead. I'm not sure if that's a typographical error. It should be Book of the Dead, or just that's what it's called, Book of Dead, as one of the oldest of all the archangels. It is believed that Israfil will blow the trumpet from a holy rock in Jerusalem to announce the day of resurrection. And then it says here that an interpreter named George Sale, I believe that's how you would pronounce his name, also classifies Israfil in his translation of the Quran as the archangel of music in Islamic tradition. And that's interesting in and of itself, because in order even to convey the idea, to convey this message, it has to be done through this music, this inventory of music, and it's done through this particular piece. And if I play it, I think I can get away with playing it. If not, we'll just have to cut this part out. I don't want to play it too much, because if we do have to cut it out, then I'll have to go back and talk all over. So you get the idea. All right. So in that sense, this message, becomes metapoetic. And the reason that it becomes metapoetic in this particular context is because if we follow this chain, if we follow this garden of forking paths down the interpretive route that I've taken it, and we arrive at the archangel of music in Islam, and we began, with a system that's based on communication as sets and playlists of music, then then the reference to the archangel of music becomes a reference to is clearly, right, co-referential with the system itself, and not merely with this song, but with the entire apparatus of the communicative system. So in that sense, you might say that the reference is metapoetic, or meta-referentially metapoetic would perhaps be a better way of describing it, right? Because meta-reference would be the system, the linguistic system or communicative system set of references, and therefore, meta-referentiality, and then the self-reflective nature of the articulation of the archangel of music would be part of the metapoiesis, right? So, in this sense, this message is a metapoetic meta-referentiality, or a metapoetic polyreferentiality, or you could say a metapoetic system reference, and we can define that in a number of ways as well. Also regarding this, this particular angel, the Quran, 39:68, and the trumpet shall be blown, so all those that are in the heavens and all those that are in the earth shall swoon, except him whom Allah will. Then it shall be blown again, then they shall stand up waiting. And if let's again think about some of the numerical values operating from the movement from which I began a conversation with this individual who perhaps can be defined by the nominalization, Pierre Jaurès, or perhaps cannot because of the overdetermination in the system. But if we begin where I began, I made a reference to the phenomenon of the number of views 144, and I made a reference to that number of likes, those thumbs up, right? 5. And I won't go into all of the meanings of that because it's an ironic riddle, and to give away all of the meanings would be unfair to Aaron, who created the riddle, and who doesn't want me revealing, the answer to his riddle, since presumably a lot of the fun of playing the game of riddles is to engage one's intellect and wealth of knowledge in order to solve the problem of what the riddle is. But I won't give away any one of many possible solution sets to the answer of that riddle. But and its gardens and branches of working paths. But I will say that it began with the number 144.5, and that number can mean a lot of things. But in connection with the idea of resurrection and the blowing of this horn, and of judgment, and particularly the judgment of souls as they pass into beyond. It very much relates to the concerns of this book that I have called 144, which is in certain ways an acknowledgement of the lives of certain individuals who have struggled against oppression, and sort of symbolically grants them a place in eternity, that because they struggled, because they either allowed their own sacrifice in the service of work to save, living beings and either humans or animals or this world or that they devoted themselves to this and overcame fear. And in the book called 144, these fearless ones are granted a place of honor in this book that is referred to as 144, both because this number means something in the Apocalyptos, and because this number, refers to, in another way, refers to David's, Psalm 144, and also, curiously, in a certain kind of way, but less obviously, also refers to, the Shakespearean sonnet 144. But that configuration of references all belong to this place, right? That the book of 144 doesn't represent as blowing a horn, but inscriptions made in that book in a certain way are parallel, to receiving, right, the message, right, that's represented here as these little linear, vectors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So like the sound waves are represented at 7, and that number 7, can't be an accident, right? 7 deadly sins, 7 virtues, 7 days of the week. Sometimes the archangels themselves are referred to 7 as 7 in number, right, as opposed to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But the 7, presumably has, some kind of symbolic value, just as my, 144 has symbolic value, and the doubling of the X, perhaps has a value too, and the fact that it retains this symmetricality, and I won't say too much about the shape that this crown, constructs on this particular fiery-haired angel's head, but the shape itself seems to speak of other types of, maybe I'll say something about the representations. It's almost the Star of David in a certain way if one reorganizes it slightly, and the number 10, of course, is associated with Christ as well, as well as having other values, and then the shape within it, in additionally, to being a kind of crown, operates as what seems to be, a kind of table almost, if one takes it as an abstracted representation of some kind of physical object, and also, perhaps a gateway, and symbolically as a form of a minimally descriptive mandala as well, and with the number 4, interestingly, and perhaps with a 5 at its center, re-inscribed into the mandala with those negative spaces, right, that provide this. If one gets closer, continue to be able to represent those 4 dots that surround the center, which could signify directions, and also, because they signify directions, the wheel of the year and the wheel of time, and anyway, a lot of complex things going on in the crowning of this figure with the double X, right? And all of that, all of that coming out of a particular direction of interpretation that we took, and that direction, a lot of the direction that we took with talking about this message comes from certain assumptions that we made from the very outset, that the message belongs in one way or another to the subjectivity of Pierre Joris, and to his reading of Salman Rushdie's the Satanic Verses, and and really much less of the sense that I'm making of this message and the connection and what it might mean, much less of the sense which it makes would appear as sense if if I began from nowhere and had no context and existed in this kind of vacuum of universality, right? So one always begins in terms of even in models like this that may seem science fiction based or may seem to exceed, right, or ordinary understanding of what the semiotic universe represents, have to proceed out of well, don't have to, but seem more substantial and seem more grounded if they proceed out of understandings of context and familiarities of discourse and organizations of language use, that have familiar patterns that can be justified within these various contextual domains. So the other thing that I would say about this reference is that, and this really exceeds the knowledge, at least that I understand Pierre Jarvis to have about my work, but isn't impossible, because Jerome Rothenberg would know this perhaps about my work. But one of the very earliest performance pieces that I did, and this was I was in high school still, and so it must have been in either 1981 or perhaps 1982, but I believe I was a senior, and I was taking this poetry class, and I was allowed to take it as I was allowed not. I guess I may have been somewhat disruptive in the class because of my curious interests in avant-garde and Dada poetry and these various modernisms that sort of weren't being represented in this particular creative writing class and poetry class, right? And so I may have been somewhat disruptive and considered radical and considered a divisive figure in in the operation of this class. So I was granted this ability to take it as an out of class kind of self-directed project, and then a lot of what I did for the work for this class was I would produce with friends and on my own in certain instances, and utilizing these sort of like found instruments or pieces of metal and things for drums and whatever cheap instruments like plastic horns, but I make these recordings that related to language and sound, and presented this as my my independent study version of this creative writing class, which is kind of interesting because it's a creative writing class that I took, but without an instructor. So if one imagines that if you're taking a class, right, that you're in being instructed by someone, this idea of the of self-instruction, right, is somewhat. It's not even really like the autodidact, because I didn't go like to source material and study it, and it's something else. It's more like perhaps a notion of being instructed by the muse or some daimon in the old Greek sense of that word, and some genius, studying under some internal genius or whatever it might have been. But this sort of autodidactic, not sick, right? Self-instructional creative writing class resulted in these various tapes that I turned in, on a either weekly or monthly basis, and then a final, performance, and that final performance at the very last minute became a representation of the apocalyptos, and so it's an early performance piece and improvisatory, and interestingly, a representation of what we've kind of come to as a message from here, right? And so exceeding, the boundaries of the context, from which this message arose in a certain way, but not entirely, because, as I said, that knowledge of the fact that was one of my early performances could be, right? Could be part of Pierre Joris's understanding of who I am, if he remembers me at all. But and which may not be the case, right? And but it's a possibility. So the possibility that this reference that we've arrived at here is itself a reference to both one of the very earliest works that I performed in, as I said, probably 1981 or 1982, and the work that I'm doing in that volume 144, which is very likely to be a reference, since I made reference to that volume and to the numerical value 144.5. Now, if I went to there's another way of I hadn't thought of it this way, but there's another way that Pierre, if he did, interpret this number, might have interpreted the 144.5. There are lists of 144 thousands in the Apocalyptos, and there are in these lists one set represents the tribes of Israel, so therefore 12. So the number 5 is a number that falls within that 12, and let's see if I may have to I'll break and then start again, and I'll get a copy of the Book of Revelation, and see what that fifth of the 12 tribes is, and if that might have a significant meaning that I was unaware of, when I began the interpretation of that other space-time travel communication coordinate 144.5, and we can go from there. But in the meantime, here's overdetermination. In the meantime, let me go ahead and find the fifth line of Psalm 144. And see, I hadn't really thought about that significance either. Okay, so this is the line. So blow down your heavens, O Lord, and come down, touch the mountains, and they shall smoke. Well, it seems to me fairly obvious that that this, at least, which I hadn't really, considered entirely in making my initial, reference to 144.5. But it seems to me that this very much, right, relates to bow down. Did I say blow down? So that's interesting. So that was a Freudian slip, or, that was a parapraxis, right? In which I probably was motivated by the desire to bring this closer to the idea of the horn, right? The blowing of the horn and these winds, right? Of ecstatic winds of liberation. But it's bow down your heavens, O Lord, and come down, touch the mountains, and they shall smoke. But even in that, one could perhaps, find a glimmer of connection, here. And let me see if I can find on. I'll just go ahead and get. I'll stop, and then I'll get a copy of the Apocalyptos and see what that fifth tribe, or if there's another set of the 144 might represent, and if we can tie it back to this particular card. So the fifth of the various sets of 12,000 that are referred to as the 144,000 sealed is one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Naphtali. And Naphtali, the name, means my struggle, which kind of makes one wonder if Hitler, if Adolf Hitler had been aware that his repulsive volume Mein Kampf made reference to the name of one of the tribes of Israel, if perhaps he might have retitled it. I believe this is also the title of a long work by a Norwegian novelist, but I haven't read that, and I actually haven't read the Adolf Hitler either, but I don't need to read it, and I have no more intention of ever reading it than I have any intention of reading the Book of Mormon, but it does make one wonder if any awareness had been there, if it might have influenced the choice of that title. And interesting in that connection, in this particular moment of the rise of, I won't even call it neo-fascism. It's just regular old ordinary global fascism that we're facing once again. So the explanation for the name of this tribe is that it's either, right, it either results from this story, this biblical narrative in which the founder of this tribe was named Naphtali, or that according to one scholar, Arthur Peake, that the Torah provides this answer, that the tribe consisted of descendants of Naphtali, the son of Jacob, and Bilhah, and it takes its name from him. Arthur Peake, whose testimony can perhaps be taken with a grain of salt, finds in it something else, recognizes it as a postdiction and eponymous form of nominalization, and that it provides an etiology, he writes, of the connectedness of the tribe to others of the Israelite Confederation, meaning, presumably the idea of struggle. I'm somewhat interested in this. Descendants of this lost tribe of Israel. The speculative descendants of Naphtali include Ethiopian Jews, also known as Beta Israel, the Mountain Jews of the Caucasus, the Bukharian Jews of Central Asia, and then this reference to Norway, which is interesting because now I'm getting interested in this Norwegian author who I only I have no memory of and haven't read, but let me see if I can find something there. And Pacific Islanders as well, Samoans, Hawaiians, Tongans, Fiji. So it's interesting in terms of if we can, and I think we can and must detach the meaning of my struggle from whatever reference that Adolf Hitler contaminated it with. It certainly bears upon a number of different aspects of the work that I'm calling 144, which is both a struggle to write because of the emotions involved in relating the oppressions and subjugations and violence done upon these heroic individuals who struggle and in some ways, overcome their fears to engage issues of human rights and the rights of others and of our environment and our struggle to protect our world and life, and then outside of the psychological difficulties of performing this work, the conditions of and restrictions, the constraints of the writing act itself for me, which bear upon my experience of the difficulty of writing by hand as a dysgraphic, and it being necessary to write it in public, and hence the recording of the inscriptions in this particular book are also a kind of struggle, and perhaps even I don't know. I mean, it's so interesting, the idea of like taking this word back, right, from the fascists, right, the it's and my experience of the internet and a lot of these like situations of hacking that I was describing before are always like these invasions of of fascist references and these hostile takeovers and or when I lived in Julian and one of my neighbors was drawing swastikas on the route that I used to walk my dog on, and then when I removed them from the road, um, wrote my name with death threats, and then when I removed those, left a dead animal on my porch, and all of which was performed under the aegis, under the shield of the police there, who I called and said, this is what's going on. And then they said, well, we can't do anything about that. That's freedom of speech. That's what I was informed, right? And it's so interesting that it's always freedom of speech, right, under fascism that allows like this kind of violence to go on. But you can't, teach about the actual history of violence in the United States now in certain states because that itself is being censored, and the censorship of libraries, right, relate to these histories of oppression that that this totalitarian, this authoritarian, this fascist emergent wants to control, the actuality of history, and so the struggle to be able to speak and to write a volume like 144 and to take back like what's been one can't even use the word struggle, right? Because because it's been misappropriated. It was misappropriated by Hitler in the early part of the 20th century, and what can the name of this tribe mean now? And even to say the name is a struggle, right? How can we erase what's been done? And the struggle to speak and to be able to speak, and the struggle to write and to be able to write, and the struggle to say what has been done to one is and so finally to take from all of this one more branching path which may or may not relate to Pierre Joris's understanding of who I am and what the book of 144 represents. But if the course of these various branching paths do relate to the book of 144, it seems to me that as a destination that we have to acknowledge a history of the Beta Israel, and this would be the terminus of this message, and in some sense one of the deepest levels of its telos, to acknowledge, this history. And how it is that the law of return for the Beta Israel which was applied by resolution 2958 on February 16, 2003, to the Falash Mura, and granted the ability for these Beta Israel to obtain citizenship and become citizens of the State of Israel. Why this has such a troubled and problematic history. And I will perhaps suggest that one of the reasons that it does have a troubled and problematic history is that it represents racism. And finally, this history, I want to make a kind of exception to the book of 144, and I'll read two paragraphs of this history and what's called controversy, and the exception that I want to make to the book of 144 is that I want this destination that we've arrived at here to be regarded as yet another inscription in that book, whether it's made by hand or whether it's recognized here. I want to acknowledge those Beta Israel who, for one reason or another, have not been allowed to return. Have not been allowed to, reach the destination of their struggle, and I'll read the background here, and this reading can be regarded as like I said, another way of inscribing those who continue to struggle, without fear, toward a goal. Today, Falash Mura who moved to Israel must undergo conversion on arrival, making it increasingly more difficult for them to get situated into Israeli society. The Beta Israel who immigrated and made Aliyah through Operation Moses and Operation Solomon were not required to undergo conversion because they were accepted as Jews under the law of return. On February 16, 2003, the Israeli government applied Resolution 2958 to the Falash Mura, which grants maternal descendants of Beta Israel the right to immigrate to Israel under the Israeli law of return and to obtain citizenship if they convert to Judaism. Today, both Israeli and Ethiopian groups dispute the Falash Mura's religious and political status.
The Israeli government fears that these people are just using Judaism as an excuse to leave Ethiopia in efforts to improve their lives in a new country. And I'm gonna make an aside here. Even if that were the only reason, that's a good enough reason. Being a displaced individual, perhaps victim of famine or oppressive political government, or victim of some natural disaster, or economic impoverishment, an effort to improve one's life in a new country, resulting from conditions of suffering, should be a sufficient cause for asylum, even if one wasn't a member of a family of displaced human beings. Right-wing member of the Israeli, and I don't know how to pronounce these words, Knesset Bezalel Smotrich was quoted saying, and here's the quote, "This practice will develop into a demand to bring more and more family members not included in the law of return." Slippery slope argument. It will open the door to an endless extension of a family chain from all over the world. I don't know how it would necessarily do that. I guess this is the gateway drug argument of the law of return. It's not explicitly stated that this is a racist policy, but they seldom are stated, either here in the United States or elsewhere. Although the government has threatened to stop all efforts to bring these people to Israel, they have still continued to address the issue. In 2018, so relatively recently, and this would be during the period in which the United States had its, first, fully fascist president, Donald Trump. In 2018, the Israeli government allowed 1,000 Falash Marah to immigrate to Israel. However, members of the Ethiopian community say that the process for immigration approval is poorly executed and inaccurate, dividing families. At least 80% of the tribe members in Ethiopia say they have first-degree relatives living in Israel and have been waiting for 20 years to immigrate. So once again, this number that's derived from 100 and this meaning, this history, this attempt to include these individuals in the book called 144 that derives from the space-time travel communication coordinate 144.5. That number was overdetermined and not of my choosing. And in my initial response to it, I didn't address these domains of its context and semantic and semiotic potentialities. But I'm glad that in considering the potentialities of this word Kantara, that we returned, and this number, 202.5, that we returned to the number 144.5 and considered some of its potential meanings, and discovered the need to include these individuals in this particular book and its set of meanings.